We're now ready to take a look at the third and fourth stages in the negotiation process and how they apply to the house on Elm Street. The third piece is closing the deal and creating a contract, and then finally there's the performance aspect. When we looked at contract creation, we mentioned that there are four key issues that you should stuff into your pocket for future negotiations. These are the key elements involved in contract creation. So let's go through these elements quickly and look at how they apply to the house on Elm Street. First of all, is there an agreement? Well, I'm assuming that if you and the other side did reach an agreement, if you were successful in your negotiation, there was an offer and an acceptance and an agreement. Was there consideration? That's a pretty easy one in this case. One side, the uncle, is transferring property, is giving up something. The other side, the company, is making payment, giving up something, and therefore consideration is present. Is the agreement legal? Well, of course, yeah, transfer of a house is legal, no problem there. Must the deal be in writing? Now, here's a stumbling block that my guess is many of you encountered. When we looked at writing, we said that either the agreement is in writing or it isn't. And if it is in writing, then there are a cluster of issues relating to a technicality called the parole evidence rule, which basically means that what you put in your final written agreement governs over any agreements you made before or at the same time as that written agreement. The issue in this case is the risk that you did not put your agreement in writing. When we talked about the writing requirements, we mentioned that generally oral contracts are enforceable, even contracts for millions of dollars. However, there are certain exceptions, there are certain rules in every country around the world that says that certain contracts must be in writing, and the example I used was the real estate contract. And so the question here is, when you negotiated your deal, did you put the agreement in writing and did you sign the agreement? As we discussed, this doesn't have to be on parchment, it doesn't have to be on fancy paper, it doesn't have to say contract at the top, it could be jotted out on a napkin. Any writing qualifies as long as it contains the right contents, the subject matter, etc., and is signed. And so if you did that, then you have a deal. If you did not do that, then you can continue negotiating. You don't yet have a deal. Just to conclude that, as a reminder of what we talked about, we talked about whether a writing is required, and here the answer to that question is yes. And then second, we said as a practical approach, you should always put your contracts in writing because the human memory is often weak, and because then if you put your agreements in writing, you don't have to worry about the subtleties of the law deciding whether it's the contract that has to be in writing or not, because you have met that requirement. So in addition to the writing requirement, there's the question of performance of the contract. And we mentioned that if there is performance, there's no problem. If there isn't performance, then hopefully you have established a dispute resolution process so that you don't have to go to court, sit around in court for years, spend a lot of money. And we specifically discussed ADR, alternative dispute resolution. So in addition to putting your contract in writing, an additional question is, did you include in the writing an ADR contract clause? This is not required, but many people, especially in business, value highly ADR clauses because it does avoid litigation. And so we talked about the different types of ADR clauses. There's the possibility of mediation alone. There's a possibility of arbitration alone. Or you can link mediation and arbitration with an escalation clause. that provides that you start with mediation, and then if mediation fails, you can move on to arbitration, and you can add an additional link. You can provide that you start with a negotiation unassisted by a third party. Then if that fails, you bring in a third party mediator, and if that fails, you bring in a third party arbitrator. So that concludes our look at how you develop the contract. The especially important issue here, did you put your contract in writing? And the performance question, have you included a dispute resolution clause? We're now ready to move on to our last part of the debrief, where we will ask whether the mythical fixed pi assumption might change the results that you reached in your negotiation.